In a secluded chamber deep in the fortress on the Spill, Ludmilla quietly smiled down at Elishnish as she gently stroked her silky, frost-white hair. The frost dragon turned snow elf had fallen asleep as they waited for nightfall, her head resting on Ludmilla's lap. Though they shared a telepathic bond that allowed them to express their thoughts and feelings to one another, she still couldn't wrap her head around all of the reasons why the frost dragon had agreed to become her companion. The way that Elishnish thought was so extraordinarily broad that Ludmilla could somewhat understand why she considered the world in the ways that she did and had trouble grasping the world that humans made for themselves. At the same time, she did have that selfish draconic side to her which was so often conveyed in songs and other forms of folklore. To even call it draconic barely scratched the surface. Being bonded with Elishnish did not give Ludmilla any sense of being an expert when it came to dragons, she only knew her dragon. Elishnish considered herself a frost dragon exemplar, meaning that she had a feral, solitary nature to her that one might perhaps compare to the proverbial lone wolf. She was proud, independent and, even when she was physically amongst others, in her mind she was alone. Being in unfamiliar situations created levels of paranoia and stress that Ludmilla decided a human would simply go insane under. Since frost dragons were always this way, it amounted to being normal for Elishnish. Where it seemed to matter the most was when that stress and paranoia diminished. Her confidence, ability and true personality would be unleashed, allowing Elishnish to display her full potential. This same behavior was what led to her falling asleep on Ludmilla's lap. After examining the small, sparsely furnished room, it was actually a dungeon cell where they had concealed themselves from potential flyovers by the Dragonlord. Elishnish plopped herself onto the bed next to Ludmilla, who was using their wait as an opportunity to catch up on her reading. The frost dragon yawned, stretched and decided right then and there that she would take a nap. As Elishnish had not slept for over a month, Ludmilla couldn't exactly say anything, but it did drive home one of the core aspects of their relationship. Among some other things that Ludmilla couldn't quite grasp, Elishnish saw her as a refuge, a haven in a dangerous world where she could lay down her head to rest. It was beyond being a friend or a companion, as Hegemil had put it. His sister had decided to accept Ludmilla as a constant in her life. A special place had been made for Ludmilla in Elishnish's generally solitary existence. Ludmilla couldn't help but frame their relationship in human terms, but she understood that it did not accurately portray what it truly was. Romance, affection and friendship were unnatural concepts to a frost dragon. Love and intimacy were gratification and pleasure that was safe. Any friendships she formed were rooted in the sense that the other party was both reliable and beneficial. One might be tempted to categorize such an outlook as distant, mercenary or even evil, but there was something else to it. No matter how beneficial, mortal relations were transient. Elishnish's approach was a way by which those with unlimited lifespans could reliably maintain their relationships over an eternity. It was a sort of immortal love that transcended the limits of mortal ties. Something that beings with limited lifespans could not genuinely comprehend, never mind consider. To Ludmilla, Elishnish's perspective was a priceless insight. People often held romantic notions of how friendship or love could be eternal, but they never considered how those relationships could be realistically achieved or how precious they truly were. Elishnish stirred and opened her eyes. Someone's coming. Ends. Germaned. Reberbad. A dozen seconds later, steps from a distant stairwell echoed down the corridor. Elishnish rose to sit upright on the bed and Ludmilla straightened her skirts. The glare of a magical lamp washed over the dark stone floor. Ludmilla put away her copy of Dreams of Red 3 before Commander Enz, Captain Germand and Officer Reberbad came into view. "How did it go?" she asked. "We had a tense moment near the end, my lady," Commander Enz answered, "but my Lord Father was able to convince the Dragon Lord that nothing was amiss." "What happened?" "It wasn't directly related to our operation," the commander said, "but she was somehow aware that something had changed in the West. This, in turn, aroused suspicions over the amount of tribute that was owed. There have been no reports of her being active in the past decade, so it's more than a bit worrisome how she knows this. Dragons can sense the domains of other dragons," Elishnish told them. "Especially if they favor the same environment. The more powerful the dragon, the larger and more apparent their domain is. The Dragon Lord here should have had a vague awareness of the White Dragon Lord's domain in the Azalisia Mountains, but its abrupt disappearance would have certainly been noticeable." Commander Renz furrowed his brow at Elishnish's explanation. As far as the Second Legion knew, She was Ludmilla's knight and a bard who possessed a wealth of information on dragons. With the small swarm of agents shadowing her as she traveled with Zusharu, it was also likely that more than a few people in the Imperial Army were aware of her travels through their connections. Out of curiosity, Commander Enz asked, would it be possible for the Sorceress Kingdom's frost dragons to sweep the Empire for the domains of other dragons? It is, but dragons don't usually settle on a domain until they become adults, so we'd miss anyone younger. Additionally, the domains of adults aren't as expansive as those of dragon lords, so it would have to be a very thorough search. Adults. The commander stroked his beard. Is that why the ancient green here kicks her kids out of the nest when she does? That's right, Ilishnish nodded. It doesn't happen with all dragons and sometimes not even with dragons of different species in the same area, but, for green dragons, it is the point when one's offspring are recognized as rivals. Ludmilla stood from the bed, examining the three men before her. Though not fearful, the apprehensive air that hung about them was palpable. That much was understandable, they were about to pick a fight with a dragon lord, after all. Does the plan require any alterations? She asked. Aside from that one hiccup, Commander Enz answered, nothing indicates that she suspects anything is going on at all. Was it plain luck, or was it due to the situation at large? Then there was the matter of the Dragon Lord's agents amongst the human population. Even if they were collaborating with Imperial intelligence, whoever was keeping things suppressed was doing an incredible job, plugging up 5 cities' worth of information leaks as well as those of the local towns and villages was an extraordinary feat. Then I suppose it's my turn, Ludmilla said. Do you know if they've left sentries? Our rangers have reported nothing up to the beginning of the jungle, Commander Enz said. We have some mages periodically using locate object to check on the progress of the tribute, and it seems that the demi-humans aren't on the alert for anything. A single juvenile dragon is overseeing the convoy. By all appearances, it's the same routine as previous years. How far have they gone? Not far, the commander said. All that treasure is heavy and the route they're using is more severe than a narrow and uneven animal trail. The procession is 5 kilometers in, at best. The ring of metallic steps sounded over the stone as Ludmilla issued her orders to her undead contingent. They made their way out of their cells and up the stairwell. She looked over her shoulder to where Ilishnish was fidgeting slightly. Ready to go? I'd rather we not go at all. The sooner we get this over with, the better. You have your new minions to show me, as well. Do you need time to equip yourself, my lady? Ludmilla turned her attention back to the 3 men. I'll be fine, Commander, she replied. The first part will mostly be in the hands of our undead forces. After that will be a long wait. In the courtyard of the fortress, she briefly reviewed the undead ranks. The Death Cavaliers would be wasted in the dense jungle, so she left them to continue their exercises with the Imperial Army southeast of Vens. What remained were 10 Death Knights, 10 Death Warriors and 5 Death Priests. They were enough to destroy the Empire a dozen times over, yet most likely insufficient to slay an ancient dragon. May the gods watch over you, Lady Zaradnik, Dame Verilyn, Commander Enz said. I suppose the undead wouldn't appreciate that, so I'll just leave my blessings with the 2 of you. Thank you, Commander, Ludmilla smiled slightly. You'll be heading out as well? The men are already on their way back to the camp at Lake Alag, so we have some catching up to do. Hopefully, this ploy works out or we'll all be choking on dragon fumes in a few hours. Hopefully. She offered them a salute before jogging out of the fortress gate with the Death Series servitors. Unlike the battle in the upper reaches where she had the advantage of superior troops and the excursion to the Katza Plains where she conducted operations under the Sorcerer King's watchful guidance, there was a distinct lack of control in the upcoming fight. Everything was predicated on uncertain assumptions and their opponent had the power to do as she wished. As she reviewed the past few days, it became apparent that the exercise was not just for the benefit of the Empire and their least undead forces, but for Ludmilla as well. As her time as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom went on, she slowly became aware of the restrictions that even Lady Sheltir and the other powerful vassals of the Sorcerer King were subject to. If it was only a matter of dealing with a specific target or place that they had an abundance of information on and could easily keep track of, moving to act against them was simple. This was, of course, provided that they did not suspect that some other powerful adversary was lurking beyond their awareness. When it came to broad power projection, however, even the martial might of the Sorceress Kingdom only covered so much. The bulk of their nation's forces were positioned in defense of its current territory, and His Majesty's most powerful vassals were mostly stationed in or around critical areas. Beyond that, things became hazy and unreliable. Information was far from perfect and forces were limited. In addition, Death Series servitors, elder liches and other standard undead troops could only die once. While they could get around quickly, the nation's most powerful forces could not be everywhere at the same time. With the Sorceress Kingdom's expanding sphere of influence would come an ever-increasing need for commanders, diplomats, merchants, sages and a myriad of other agents to represent its interests abroad. Those who currently acted in that capacity were pioneers, learning the lessons that would go towards building the institutions of the Sorceress Kingdom. With those institutions, they would educate and train those who would serve important roles in the future. Upon leaving dark vision range of the fortress, Ludmilla increased their pace. She scanned the jungles that grew denser with each passing minute and the mountains that rose on both sides of their route. "Have you noticed any observers, Elishnish?" "No, but concealing oneself at a distance in these conditions is a simple matter. The only ones who could see us from so far that they elude my detection would be dragons. However, I doubt that young ones would be lingering so close to the edge of their territory. I know you people tend to consider us universally powerful for some reason, but we have many predators in the early stages of our lives." Ludmilla quick-swapped into her combat equipment as the undergrowth grew thick around them. Calls of nocturnal insects, birds and other animals filtered through the trees. Most were unfamiliar, making her peer in every direction as the trail turned into a muddy, uneven pathway crisscrossed by thick tree roots. More than a few Death Series servitors slipped and tripped as they tried to maintain their pace. "Let's slow down a bit. Elishnish, can you check how far ahead this convoy is?" Elishnish swiftly padded ahead, vanishing into the trees on one side of their path. Ludmilla wrinkled her nose at the smell of rotten eggs issuing from the steaming waters of a stream nearby. Wildlife moving through the undergrowth before the advance of the undead column made it difficult to discern if anything was watching them through the layers of dense vegetation above and below. 15 minutes later, Elishnish's thoughts sounded in her head. "I found them. Do you think I can keep some of that treasure?" Ludmilla halted the column. "That treasure belongs to the Empire. How far away are you?" Less than 2 kilometers further on. The trail follows that stream into a steep gully. Or more like the trail merges with the stream. They've mucked their way about halfway through to the river on the other side." She resumed their advance, eyeing the surroundings for demi-human scouts. If the convoy was stuck navigating a narrow space, the Death Series servitors would be able to dispatch them with few complications. "Do they have a rear guard? What about sentries posted above the gully?" "There are several hundred demi-humans here, so I guess the bunch still waiting to get through count as a rear guard. A juvenile green is watching from the ledge above on the northeast side. I don't see anything else." "Are there any particularly strong ones?" "A few, by human standards. Actually, they're all quite strong by human standards. If we go by the ranks of the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild, they're all gold and above. There are a few dozen lord types ranging from Mithril to Orichalcum directing everyone else. In a straight contest, it wouldn't be a problem for the Death Series servitors, but she wasn't sure if the lords possessed any skills or abilities that might complicate things. Then again, she wanted a sizable portion to flee and report the attack. "We're about a kilometer away. Can you take care of that green dragon?" "Wheel. Done." "Eh? I just killed him. That's what you wanted, yes?" Ludmilla urged the undead column into a sprint. A handful tripped over the treacherous terrain and fell on their faces. One death priest stumbled and tumbled into the nearby stream. She winced at the loud splash. "I did want that, but I was hoping to time it with our attack to create more confusion." "Well, there. I threw his corpse into the gully. A dragon just landed on them and now they're plenty confused. See? It worked out in the end." Ludmilla narrowed her eyes at another notion that was conveyed through their bond. "You were worried about something else?" "It's a valid concern. If one of those Death Knights got the dragon, we'd end up with a squire zombie dragon. I don't see a problem with that. It's actually a rather intriguing prospect." "It's a waste. Have you tried skinning a zombie?" Now that Elishnish mentioned it, zombies didn't yield any workable crafting materials. The undead column made its final approach. Roughly 300 meters away, The demi-humans gathered at the top of the gully turned to look back at the clamor coming towards them. The range of their dark vision was limited, however. By the time the undead and demi-humans finally came within sight of one another, it was too late for a proper reaction. Dozens of hewn bodies were thrown into the air upon impact, crashing back onto the heads of the confused demi-humans further ahead and rolling down the stream. It was only then that cries of panic started to rise towards the canopy. Not too messy. Get full squads of intact squire zombies and as many zombies for them as possible. Avoid damage to the wagons. If any dragons show up, don't zombify them. The 10 Death Knights stepped to the fore, forming a line that pushed into the massive demi-humans. The confused procession quickly turned into a stampede as demi-humans threw down their burdens and tried to flee. Directing things from behind the line, Ludmilla focused on identifying demi-human lords for the Death Warriors to eliminate. Since the handover of the Empire's tribute was a ceremonial affair, the Dragon Lord had gathered the strongest of the Blisters tribes as a show of prestige. With this being the case, Ludmilla's opening attack was an opportunity to liquidate the demi-human leadership and paralyze the tribes. Ideally, it would minimize effective resistance against the Imperial army when they came to do their part. Zombies rose as the Death Knights and their squad smashed through the rearguard and started working their way down the gully. Roughly halfway down, they stepped over the corpse of a green dragon. Its long neck was folded over itself. "Did you do this?" Elishnish hopped down to join her, leaning forward to examine the dead dragon. "Yes? It's a good way to minimize damage to the corpse. For materials and such. I'm selling that, by the way." Ludmilla silently shook her head as she watched her companion stuff the body into one of her infinite haversacks. When they reached the bottom of the gully, she called off the attack, allowing the remaining demi-humans to flee. She turned to address her now much larger undead contingent. "Let's get this cargo back out. We're proceeding to the next phase." "Ooh, another one." Ludmilla looked over at Elishnish. Her companion was holding up a blue stone between her thumb and forefinger. Her silvery aqua snow elf eyes seemed to glitter as she tried to look at the stone and sniff it at the same time. Ludmilla supposed that, as a dragon, this wouldn't have been a problem. Elf heads, however, were not appropriately shaped for the action. "What is it?" Even with Elishnish's thoughts being conveyed to her, Ludmilla couldn't tell what it was. All she knew is that it was a rough blue stone. The smell of valuables certainly did not translate into anything she could perceive. A sapphire. It was mixed in with the smell of the treasure in the convoy. "Now that I've had time to look around, it appears that these demi-humans are carrying treasures of their own. I've never seen a raw sapphire before." Elishnish went over to an ogre-turned-squire zombie and untied a woven pouch from its rawhide belt. She upended it into her palm. Her face lit up into a brilliant smile when more than a dozen thumbnail-sized stones spilt out. 3 emeralds, 2 sapphires, 6 rubies, 4 diamonds, pyrite. With a flick of her wrist, she cast the lump of metallic crystals into one of the wagons nearby. The rest disappeared into an infinite haversack. After the seizure of the treasure convoy, Ludmilla ordered the Death Knights to organize their newly acquired squire zombies and set them to work transporting the Empire's tribute back out of the jungle. As zombies, the former demi-humans were much stronger than before, but they were also much slower. At the same time, they did not tire, so she couldn't decide whether they were moving slower or faster than when they were alive. Elishnish continually cast covetous glances at their cargo, and Ludmilla continually reminded her that it belonged to the Empire and they would be returning it to them. This, however, didn't stop her from doing dragon-y things like sinking her hands up to her elbows into piles of coins or sniffing everything or looking generally pleased with the sight. A while later, her attention shifted from the wagons to the undead conveying the loads of treasure. Since she couldn't take any of the Empire's tribute, she went to loot the undead demi-humans. Ludmilla couldn't stop frowning as she watched her knight moving about like a brazen footpad filching valuables in plain sight. "Make sure you keep track of what you find. Actually, if you have an empty infinite haversack, use that one for all this." "Why?" "I need to report our findings. After that, I have to figure out what we'll do with it." Elishnish straightened and turned to look at her, another sack dangling limply from her fingertips. "What do you mean by what we'll do with it? You don't plan on keeping all that, do you?" "Of course I do. That's what treasure is for, Dragons. The Frost Dragon went back to pilfering the violently conscripted undead demi-humans. At least she used a different infinite haversack. How spoils were distributed was undefined in Riastai's law, something negotiated in times of war. Like many rewards, loot was generally a tool used by those in authority to incentivize desired behaviors and show favor to those who faithfully rendered service. On paper, all spoils were the property of the highest-ranked participant in the war, usually the king or a high noble, or a set of high nobles if there was a joint effort that didn't include the king. A portion of these spoils went towards replenishing coffers used to fund the war. The rest was distributed to vassals, who in turn used it to award their own subordinates. She highly doubted that it would work out so neatly in practice, but Riastais had not had any wars with substantial material gains since its founding years. As a frontier noble who was legally entitled to expand her territory, Ludmilla was well versed in how things would go if she were to wage a defensive war or conquer more land. Simply put, everything belonged to her and she could do as she wished with it. With this being the case, one could attract investment into their war effort by offering returns out of realized gains or distributing licenses to conduct industrial operations or trade on the newly acquired land. It only worked when there were tangible gains to entice others with, such as finding gold or other valuable commodities in a region. House Zaradnik could never put this idea into practice because there were no identified resources other than what could be extracted from lands that carried far fewer risks. That being said, she was currently just a liaison officer participating in a military operation being conducted by the Baharuth Empire. The undead forces were under lease, so the fruit of their efforts similarly belonged to the Imperial Army. While many laws had changed from its time as a part of Riastais, the right of spoils had not. It was already to the Emperor's advantage, after all. According to the Imperial Army's regulations, everything found was to be submitted with a report by the company captains. Instead of the king redistributing the gains to his vassals, the emperor redistributed it to the military. It was one of the many measures employed to help ensure that the loyalty of the army went to the imperial throne. We'll see how much we can negotiate for you. Negotiate? This is an operation of the Imperial Army, after all. They supposedly award by merit, so I'm sure you can come out of it with something. I could have obliterated this entire convoy without a scratch, you know. I know. But you're not killing the Viridian Dragon Lord on your own. Do you think I'll be able to get a percentage of her hoard? Ludmilla smiled in amusement as Ilishnish's protests abruptly reversed direction, turning coolly calculating. Considering the magnitude of your contributions, I would say so. It is ultimately up to the Imperial Army, however. With the generally upright behavior displayed by the Second Legion, Ludmilla expected that they would also be fair to Ilishnish, especially if she played a crucial role in the operation. The Frost Dragon would naturally want as much as she could get, but, at the same time, Ludmilla was sure that she would take what they offered since it would be more than what she could get on her own. Thoughts of how the Imperial Army handled the seizure of enemy assets led to how the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom would deal with the same issue in the future. While their current policy meant that they were not an expansionary power, they would still be called upon to aid their allies and act against threats beyond their borders if necessary. There would be commanders from the citizenry, strong demi-humans like the Frost Giants and auxiliary forces that supported the main units of the military to consider. Strangely enough, it was not the living that Ludmilla was primarily concerned about, but the undead. While one might believe that undead servitors who would faithfully carry out their orders would be immune to such behavior, she suspected that the opposite might be the case. If they started equating plunder as gains for the Sorcerer King, they would do everything in their power within the bounds of their orders to acquire wealth and resources from vanquished enemies and their territories. The way Ilishnish's eggs were taken from her was a worrisome indication that it was more than a needless worry. With such a thing happening to a citizen of the Sorceress Kingdom, Ludmilla couldn't imagine what would happen if one wasn't. Clear regulations and procedures had to be created and refined before an unfortunate mishap occurred. This is plucked cockatrice. She raised a hand to her ear out of habit as a message spell connected. Greenskirts here, are these codenames truly necessary? Gartenberg did happen, after all. We don't want a repeat of that here, my lady. Officer Raborbad said so, but Ludmilla wasn't sure that it was possible to destroy a nation with 3 message spells. First of all, one needed to know who they were contacting. One couldn't randomly send misinformation to an official that they didn't even know existed. As long as the appropriate channels for information were set up and adequate measures were in place to verify said information, it should be nearly impossible to fool an organization in that fashion. Did you find the convoy? 30 minutes ago. We're on our way back out. There was a long pause in the message. That was 3 hours faster than the General Staff's prediction, which was 3 hours slower than hers. Working on the field with the Imperial Army turned out to be far easier than dealing with the 2nd Legion's General Staff. With everything being cross-examined in the planning phases, the gap between the performance of the Sorceress Kingdom's forces and that of the Imperial Army created a similar gap in their projections. It took 20 laps around the walls of Ents to convince them that the Death Knights, Death Warriors and Death Priests were as fast on foot as she claimed. The jungle terrain slowed them down considerably, but the way back didn't matter as much with how slow the zombies were. We'll be in position by mid-morning. After that, we'll see how long it takes for the Viridian Dragon Lord to find out. I'll let headquarters know. Was there anything else you'd like to add? Has anything changed out there? I'm not sure. We're still on our way to the lake and it's too dark to see anything. I haven't received any reports, at any rate. In that case, no. Our next contact will be in an hour, then. The message spell ended. With the success of the raid confirmed, the 2nd Legion's air wing would deploy over the blister to watch for the movements of the Viridian Dragon Lord. Depending on where her lair was, it would take the strongest of the gnolls she had let escape anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to inform her of the attack. This was assuming they went straight to her. If they did not report to her out of fear of punishment, Ludmilla and her undead contingent might be waiting until the dragon started wondering why her tribute was taking so long to arrive. As time went on, the Death Series servitors continued to noisily make their way through the undergrowth and the convoy shuffled forward at their painfully slow pace. Ludmilla eyed Elishnish, who was still industriously stripping the zombies of their valuables. There haven't been any potential threats along the way at all? Not that I've detected. Beasts will avoid all the noise. If this lot consists of the strong demi-humans that the Dragon Lord wanted to show off, then any demi-human that gets within dark vision range will have already been detected by my blind sight. How far does blind sight go? It depends on the strength of the individual. The radius of mine has increased substantially since spring. Without any obstacles or attempts at concealment, my blind sight can detect an average human standing in any Ranthal street from 350 meters. How solid the response is falls off drastically as distance increases. The range of Elishnish's blind sight seemed like a lot. At least until one considered how fast she could move. In a full dive, it probably amounted to a few seconds of forewarning and it took time for her to alter her trajectory. If a dragon's blind sight becomes more extensive as they grow in power, how can we even get close to this Dragon Lord? We should have no problems. The both of us have substantial concealment abilities, after all. By the time she notices us, we'd already be on top of her. The Death Knights, on the other hand, are even less stealthy than the average human civilian. They'll have to be positioned in advance and hidden from her senses somehow. According to Elishnish, blind sight was a sort of super sense that combined all of a dragon's considerably powerful senses. Even when one was out of a dragon's line of sight, a myriad of other things could give them away. Sound, smell, taste and various tactile senses such as the ability to pick up vibrations in the air and minute changes in temperature and pressure made it very difficult to avoid notice. Odors, heartbeats, breathing, the warmth of one's body, they could all be picked up by a dragon's blind sight. A dragon could even force the issue. By landing or even taking a step, they sent vibrations over the ground and through anything touching the ground or whatever it was shaking. Concealment skills that masked movement, visibility, sound, odor and everything else were the direct counter to blind sight, but the Death Series servitors lacked any of them. The way they clumped around and moved their bodies made them extremely easy to notice. After a few more check-ins by Officer Aburbad via message, they reached the boundary of the spill. There, Ludmilla and Elishnish went to work setting up their ambush. After finding a set of roots for a death warrior to lie between, Ludmilla stomped her foot twice on the ground. Can you sense it now? Its right leg is sticking out. Ludmilla looked around the tree trunk to the thinning jungles beyond, but Elishnish had concealed herself. She could only sense the vague distance and direction to her companion. After having the death warrior shift its leg, she stomped her foot again. How about now? I can still sense it, but it might be because I already know it's there.
Oh, what did you do just now?
I covered it with leaves and dirt.
That works too.
If the layer is sufficient, it will blanket any vibrations coming off of objects enough to not notice what's under the surface. It's the same way with buildings and closed rooms. I have to get much closer to sense what's going on inside them. They went around hiding the rest of the death warriors in the trees around the convoy. 5 were positioned in the younger growth of the spill while the others were nestled in the much denser vegetation of the blister. The Death Knights and Death Priests were placed on either side of the trail coming out of old growth, though no efforts at concealment were made beyond keeping them out of sight. As they lay in wait, Ludmilla periodically walked up and down to check their preparations. After the 6th re-examination, another message connected. It was earlier than scheduled.
This is Plucked Cockatrice.
Greenskirt's here. Is she coming?
Yes.
One of the flights just spotted her flying over the trees towards the spill. At her speed, she'll be there in under 30 minutes.
I see. Thank you, Mr. Cockatrice. May the gods watch over you, my lady. The message disconnected.
Ludmilla took a deep breath, letting it out in a long sigh as she made her way southwest along the edge of the ancient jungle.
Elishnish, she's coming. It's time to go.
Claws clicked over the cavern floor, a steady sound that echoed down into Ryrixixthrius' lair. The clicking came closer, grew louder, eventually framing its source.
A troglodyte.
Something was wrong. In most cases, one of her brood would come to see her for one thing or the other, usually to boast or report achievements in their continuous efforts to curry her favor. Whether it be a feat of personal prowess or something that their minions did or learned, all claims to tangible gains were ultimately a dragon's by right. This, of course, also worked in reverse. If something went wrong, minions were sent to deliver the bad news. The worse the news, the lower the minion, and troglodytes were the lowest of the low. If one were to be diplomatic, they would call the race of reptilians hardy, long-lived and pure of spirit and mind. If not, well, troglodyte was a universal insult in more civilized places for good reason. The troglodyte appeared out of an access shaft that led to the labyrinthine network of old lava tubes above Ryrixixthrius' lair. Someone had probably approached the colony of tens of thousands of troglodytes and wheedled one of them into delivering whatever it was about to say. Being as mentally slow as they were, she doubted that this messenger fully understood the message it was delivering. Head half submerged, she watched as a female troglodyte in mottled, greenish-gray scales made her way down to the cavern floor and around the edge of the water. The reptilian demi-human prostrated itself on a smooth stone slab placed for precisely that purpose. Her speech was slow and slurred, bringing to mind the image of a lizard turned sluggish by the cold.
Nance.
Null come.
The troglodyte paused as if trying to parse what she had just said.
Bubbles of noxious gas rose to the surface of the water as Ryrixixthrius sighed. It was nice to have some reptilian minions, but troglodytes were a far cry from dragonkin or kobolds. Only the luckiest of dragon lords had those. Trey. Ryrixixthrius narrowed an eyelid.
Shiny, the troglodyte nodded slowly. Gone.
Stole.
What?
Her oar blasted the troglodyte away and it tumbled out of sight. A wave crested and broke over the shore as she surfaced to make her way to the lake entrance of her lair.
Preposterous.
Who would do such a thing? The tribes of the jungle would know that it was a futile act and the reprisal upon its inevitable discovery would be the extermination of their people. Could it be one of her children, overwhelmed by greed at the sight of the Baharuth Empire's tribute? If so, she would tear them apart. Xerix, too, since he had let it happen. If he had survived. No, she wouldn't stop there. The entire generation had to be culled as a lesson to the next. That way, they would have ample incentive to set upon the next idiot who expressed the blasphemous desire to lay their covetous claws upon what was hers. Mud churned from the lake bed as she made her way up with powerful strokes. An overcast sky greeted her as she erupted from the surface, wings carrying her over the trees. High overhead, a flight of hippogriffs soared lazily just below the clouds. As she flew southeast to where the treasure convoy should have been, she spotted another set of hippogriffs, then another. Nearly all of them were loitering over the perimeter of the jungle. What were the chances that the Empire had reneged on their commitment and acted to steal her treasure? Rationally speaking, the thought did not hold much water. Like the demi-human tribes,
The risk that such an act carried was simply too great. For a pittance of their annual productivity, they would lose everything. Then again, humans were as stupid as troglodytes in some ways. Especially when it came to the race's collective, mindless greed that consumed everything in its path. After considering that line of thought for several minutes, she dismissed it as unlikely. The tribal representatives collected to convey the tribute could crush an imperial legion 3 times over. Considering that they would be fighting in the ancient jungles of her home, the entire imperial army would be devoured trying to invade. Something else had to be going on. Ririk 6-3 aside a trio of hippogriffs flying in the vicinity of the nearby fortress being led by a griffin. The griffin's rider was most likely the commander of the local legion's air wing. She cast a message spell. Worm. Hi. At least he responded in a satisfying way. Why are you flying there? What are you watching for? Spit it out. Why, Your Eminence, we've received reports of a powerful group of undead that came from the west. We lost track of them when they entered the forests south of the mountains. Ririk 6-3 narrowed her eyes at the claim. Undead? What did they look like? A string of villagers were sent into a panic, but their reports were confusing. We're keeping an eye out for something like humanoid undead. She cut off the message. While she wasn't close enough to know for sure, it didn't sound like the human was lying. The Empire wouldn't put its air wings on alert for no reason, either. Powerful undead, villagers that survived to report them. The only way something like that would happen is if the undead were under the control of a greater power. Otherwise, the villagers would have been devastated and the Empire busy fighting the undead rampaging over the countryside. Ririk 6-3's mind worked, sifting through centuries of accumulated knowledge. Undead of substantial strength existed in the world, but the region around Ririk 6-3's domain had elder liches and weak vampires at best. There was a rumor that the Empire had defeated a Death Knight from the Katza Plains some time ago, but it remained a singular incident. Could it be that they had come from the world beyond specifically for the tribute? The timing was extraordinarily suspect. A powerful Night Lich might be able to challenge her openly, though it was more likely that they would fight from a more advantageous, defensive position. The annual delivery of the Empire's tribute wasn't exactly a secret. A Night Lich's powerful minions could have been sent to secure her treasure and carry it off to a predetermined location. Once there, they could take their time to teleport or fly it away. At that juncture, her property would be lost to her. Assaulting a powerful undead caster in their base was a questionable venture at best. Ririk 6-3 hurtled forward, her wings steadily beating as she picked up speed. She skimmed over the trees, sensitive for any sign of the undead or her stolen treasure. A distant metallic clanking drew her attention. She ascended to a safer altitude, watchful for enemies in the skies around her. After making 2 wide circuits, nothing appeared to challenge her. The Imperial air patrols remained where they were, the closest several kilometers distant. Below, a long line of wagons laden with treasure was creeping out of the jungle. The figures moving everything appeared oblivious to her presence. As she examined the thieves, incredulity filled her being. Zombies? Zombies are stealing my treasure? They were undead demi-humans whose slow, shuffling progress made it seem the case. She dove upon them, heading off the procession with a furious roar. Scores of zombies were blown back by her landing, tumbling away like so many pieces of refuse. Thieves! You dare touch what is mine? In response, hundreds of zombies shuffled forward. Ririk 6-3 rolled her eyes. That was the problem with the undead. Never mind the mindless ones, only those possessed of the greatest intelligence had any sense of self-preservation. All others followed thought processes that tended to travel in straight lines, so to speak. As they were generally unaffected by hostile mental effects, intimidation and even dragon fear did not work on them. They were also immune to poison, which meant that her breath weapon was useless. She would have to sort them out in some tedious fashion, or did she? Leaping into the air, she hovered over a place further down the road, waiting for the stream of zombies to gather beneath her. Once a decent-sized pile had formed, she cast a spell. Fireball. The stench of rotting flesh in the air became the stench of burning rotting flesh as the zombies were swept up in a mass conflagration. She nodded in satisfaction at the result, but it was short-lived. Further on, the advancing zombies stopped and turned around. Their controller must be in the trees somewhere. From a distance,
She didn't see anything resembling an older lich. Upon returning to the wagons, she carefully inspected her tribute for damage, tampering or magic items sneakily placed in the piles of coins and treasure. Her nose twitched and her scales rippled in disgust when she found a lump of pyrite in one of the wagons. It flew away with a flick of a claw. The zombies continued their retreat. She continued checking her belongings, content to see where the undead would go. She paused in confusion when something new entered the range of her blind sight. A death knight? The zombies eventually shuffled to a stop, spread out amongst the trees nearby. By then, several more death knights had entered into her awareness. What's going on here? 10 death knights did not simply appear out of nowhere. Even one was an extraordinarily rare occurrence. Furthermore, there were 5 unfamiliar figures hiding behind the trees with the death knights. She could only think of one thing. Her mate, who laired several thousand kilometers to the southeast, often boasted of the interesting bits of information that he had collected in his efforts to impress her. One particularly curious topic was that of an association for intelligent undead beings. They were steadily rising to prominence in the distant south, where a number had carved out odd little states along the edge of the frozen wastes. The great alliance of nations that had formed in response was probably on their 9th or 10th crusade to remove them. For their part, the undead seemed to have settled on their lot in unlife. Some people traded with them, which brought wealth. Other people attacked them, which brought corpses. As far as she knew, however, they had no influence in her little corner of the continent. A bold raid conducted by undead adventurers? Or something like that. If they were simply passing through, she would have probably gone over to chat with them and learn what was going on in the wide world. Unfortunately for them, tampering with a dragon's assets demanded unapologetic liquidation. "I know you're there," she called out to them. "You cannot hide from me." Several moments passed before the 10 death knights came out of hiding. The 5 unknown figures remained behind the trees. Her tail lashed over the ground. Did they honestly believe she could be fooled? Eyeing the death knights forming a small wall of shields before her at the tail end of the convoy, Ririk Sixthrius peered at each one. Death knights could vary in strength, but they had some commonalities. The first was that they were quite resilient as far as most undead beings went, but, offensively speaking, they were weak. They could also create a swarm of zombies out of the slain, which was what she supposed had happened here, but those zombies were inconsequential. She took a step forward. If it was 10 death knights, her victory was assured. There would be some scratches from their tiny swords, but the harm to her would ultimately be negligible. If the 5 figures in hiding were unexpectedly strong, they would have already attacked her. "Thank you for lining up so neatly," Ririk Sixthrius told them as she advanced. "Now, it is time to pay for your transgressions." With a lazy slash of her right foreclaw, she sent 2 of the death knights flying. Behind the trees, 2 of the unknown figures moved. The sound of spellcasting drifted over the air and the grievous damage she had inflicted upon the death knights visibly repaired itself. Healers, some sort of mummy? That they could heal the death knights in a timely fashion indicated that they were respectable casters. Because they did not resort to using spells against her, however, they probably were not strong enough for an effective offense. They thought they might be able to outlast her between the resilience of the death knights and their unseen healers, but they lacked the offensive power to cause any significant harm. It was a common, boring tactic employed in every corner of the world. The weak banded together thinking they could outlast the strong, never realizing what true strength was until they inevitably met their wretched deaths. So reassured, she sent another pair of death knights flying away. The remainder fell into an orderly retreat, backing away with their shields raised. Amusement rose within her. Could she strike fear into the undead? What pitiful ploy did they plan to put into motion? Perhaps the raid on her tribute was ultimately a good thing. These undead were far stronger than the giants she had wrested the jungles from in her younger days. It would be a grand achievement for Ririk Sixthrius, one that would spread her fame far and wide. All would fear and revere the Viridian Dragon Lord. She stomped after the Death Knights, daring the unseen casters to do their worst. 2 of them stepped out from behind the huge, ancient trees on either side, raising their flails over their heads. Voices that bubbled like festering rot rose into the air. "Flame strike! Flame strike!" Twin pillars of flame roared down to strike Ririk Sixthrius. She laughed as they washed harmlessly over her body, negated by her spell resistance. It was a good try, Almost any caster would expect at least some damage to get through. Unfortunately for them, they were fighting an ancient dragon, an existence that denied the feeble magics of lesser beings. An assortment of offensive spells rained down on her as the other undead casters joined the assault. The Death Knights advanced, blades brandished behind their black tower shields. She swept them all away with a single slap of her tail. The zombies milling about everywhere were crushed under her claws. Weak. Pathetic. Their lack of experience in fighting dragons was made laughably clear. Their lack of terror and groveling made the experience uninspiringly bland. Quickly growing bored, she turned on the nearest caster. As with its silhouette in her blind sight, its visual appearance was unfamiliar. Its black robes and other trappings suggested a type of divine caster, but it clearly was not a mummy. It dove behind its tree as her claw came slashing in. Splinters of moss-covered wood sliced through the air as she gouged out a meter-deep furrow in the ancient trunk. A flick of her tail launched an unwary undead caster on the other side of the trail into the distant undergrowth. Something flickered through the trees, burying itself in her left haunch. Ryrix turned her attention away from the undead caster with more surprise than pain as she was hit 4 more times in the side. What was that? Pricking her flank was a line of dark metal bolts with black fletchings. They didn't amount to much, but she had not experienced a threat to this degree since her battle for supremacy over the jungle with the giant tribes. She quickly sorted through the swarm of constantly moving zombies, discovering 5 more unfamiliar figures over 200 meters away. The figures in the distance raised their weapons and 5 more crossbow bolts came zipping in. 2 of them bounced harmlessly off of her scales while the rest found perches. She roared in annoyance, charging through the trees towards her nearest assailant. Then 5 more bolts struck her from behind. There were 10 of the undead crossbowmen. Her quarry ducked behind a tree. She slowed to twist her neck and snap at it with her jaws. From nearby, another undead hurled a javelin and several axes came twirling in. Ryrix snarled as the javelin bounced off the bony ridge of her brow. She drew her head back. Axes, javelins and crossbow bolts chipped away at her scales. Annoying. They were using her size against her. The colossal ancient trees were hindering her mobility. Something else was wrong, as well. They were too coordinated, much like demi-human tribes under the influence of a lord. Was there such a thing as lord-type undead? Undead that controlled other undead like elder liches were common enough, but they did not enhance collective performance in the same manner. Considering the strength of the undead currently attacking her, the lord commanding them would likely be powerful enough to present a deadly threat. A trap. These undead were being used to weaken her before the leader of their raid joined the fray. Ryrix loped over to the nearest clearing, ignoring the irritating assault being directed against her. Whoever it was, they were 100 years too early to think they could outplay an ancient green dragon. They had come for her treasure. None appeared to be capable of teleportation or flight. Once they were well away from the trees with her tribute, she could begin the battle anew in a place of her choosing. With so many zombies destroyed, it would take them weeks to move everything. She could bide her time and come up with a suitable strategy while she rested and healed. Then she would return to enact her vengeance. Unfurling her wings, Ryrix gathered her legs under her. With a single, powerful movement, she launched herself into the air. Something smashed into her from above. Her head whipped forward, slamming into the ground.